Comparing a 1970 LS6 head. This is a modern, you can buy these right now, AFR 335, the one they call the Enforcer. And this guy right here is a Pro Stock head from the early 90s. Would be a good time to show some comparison stuff. So this is a 291. The casting number ends in 291. And this is a 1970 LS6 cylinder head. This would have been on a production 450 horse, 454. And this was the cat's meow of the day. This is the high performance head of the day. This right here, this is an AFR cylinder head. And this is one of the 335s. They call it the Enforcer. There's the AFR logo. And these things, I think out of the box, they flow 340, 335 or something at like 700 lift. And then this is an old Pro Stock head. This is the one off the motor in my blue Camaro. The combustion chambers on these early big block heads, specifically this 291 casting, I believe these were 106, I want to say. The volume, CC volume. These AFRs, and I've ported these. You can see there's a whole bunch of chamber work done in here. It's not just polished, and I'll point out some of the mods that I did, but the AFRs are huge. They're, man, they're probably 125 cc chambers, so you got to run a huge dome. And then these heads here, and wanted to point out, because people are going to notice. So you see all this stuff. It almost looks like some crap went through the motor and, you know, tore some stuff up. These heads, and I'm going to do a full expose on just these heads, but there's 3/4 of an inch plus of material welded onto the deck. And then these heads were angle milled and rolled to about 11 degrees. And what you're actually seeing with all this little imperfection in the surface and in the chambers, that's porosity in the weld. There's hours and hours and hours of welding and modifying. The longer you look at these heads, the more you just go, holy cow. So with all that welding, that got these chambers down to 76 cc's. So you got about 106, 108, probably 125 to 128. And 76 cc's. So it's basically a open chamber small block head. One of the biggest issues with the early heads is the valves are very much shrouded, meaning the valve is close to something. And so even with the valve open, the air has to get between the edge of the valve, you know, the edge of this valve here and this, the combustion chamber wall. There's not very much room. Same thing with the intake. You got a lot of shrouding going on. And so, and again, these are ported already, so they look a little better than they would have out of the box. In fact, before this video is over, I'll pull out an unported AFR to show the difference. But like I've back cut under here to just open that up a little bit. And I've cut back a lot here. And then did the same thing. In fact, let me show it here. On the exhaust, this is back cut, and this. And then the other thing is this roll right here. So this used to be a sharp edge, like right, the deck of the head used to go in to like right here. And this is rolled out on this exhaust valve. And that one little mod doesn't really show up on the flow bench, but it's about 20 horsepower. And it also makes peak horsepower in a broader RPM range. In other words, if it would have hit peak within a 200 or 300 RPM range, it'll stay flat at peak and 20 horsepower higher for maybe 700 RPM. Even on these pretty good modern head, for just being a 24 degree, you know, off the shelf, anyone can buy it bolted on. You got to have the valve open. You know, the valve's never going to clear even the chamber when it's even with a huge cam. And so you got a lot of shrouding to get air to flow around that valve. The other thing is the bore size. So once the valve, see if I can reach one from underneath. So once the valve gets open far enough to clear where it's shrouded, you can see how shrouded that is. Then the other thing that's critical is the bore, because now you got the cylinder bore in the way, right? The valve is open, but the bore of the cylinder is going to keep the valve from flowing because it's got to get between the valve and the bore. And that's why on these heads, there's so many improvements to flow. And one of the biggest things is the valve doesn't have to lift very far to be completely out of the chamber. And because the chambers are so small, there's just no chamber in the way. Like this mod right here on the exhaust side, that's just already built in to this head. And so that's why when the heads are flowed on the flow bench, the tube, the cylinder tube that it's flowed into, you need to know what the bore size of your engine's going to be, because if you put this on a this wouldn't even work because the head's too big. But if you say you put this on a 454, which is a 4250 bore, and the bore I'm running is a 4630, so that's a big difference in bore diameter. And because this valve is going to be opened and you're going to have the cylinder wall right here shrouding the valve, going from a 4250 to a 4615 is going to open a lot of room between the valve and the cylinder wall, and the valve is going to flow way better in that big bore. Or I should say the head is going to flow, and that valve is going to allow the air to get around it because you won't have the bore shrouding it. And on this LS6 head, somebody got in here and did a little bit of match porting, but if you look, if I can get some light in there, they didn't really touch the bowl or behind the valve or anything. It's pretty much stock. And if you look at the angle of the port floor, it's pretty flat. Kind of ironically, on these AFR heads, the ports they're bigger. They're not a lot bigger. When I ported these heads, though, I did not make this opening any bigger at all. I mean, it's a tiny bit bigger because I cleaned up the castings and then I match ported the tunnel ram, but I did not like purposely hog this or make this any bigger. And these heads, by the way, they went from flowing about 335. They flow about 415 on the good port, about 408 on the bad one now. And all I did was just reshaped a few things. And I'm not going to go over everything that I did, but basically didn't make the port any bigger. In fact, the velocity of the port is up about 25% from stock, and it flows like 70 plus CFM better than it did. So, if anyone can just, take a trash can and cut the bottom out of it and have a gigantic hole, it's going to flow a lot of air, but your port velocity is going to go, into the toilet, and it's going to be a garbage head. So to keep the head velocity way up, and actually increased it quite a bit, and flow a bunch more air, that's the goal. That's what you want. And now keep in mind too that this AFR head right here, this is modern technology, right? This is what you can buy right now. And then you got this, and this was probably done around 1990. And again, I'm going to do a full expose on this head, but just for example, the reason you see this difference here, that's all weld. There's like 3/4 of an inch plus that was welded onto just the deck of the heads, not counting all the welding in the combustion chambers. So these heads could be angle milled and rolled to about an 11-degree valve angle. But so when you look through the tunnel ram on this head, the tunnel ram comes down like this, right? And then it has to make this huge turn into the port floor. And on this engine right here, when you look down through the tunnel ram, it's the identical angle. The tunnel ram there's no transition from the intake manifold to the port angle. It's just straight. And then if you look at the valve, if you look at the line of sight to the valve, compared to this, there's a big, again, this port floor actually raises up and then it turns and goes down into the valve. And this port floor is so raised up starting out. In other words, this part here on this head, I mean, look at this. Look at the difference. You got this whole deck area that doesn't even exist under the stock head. So the port is raised way, way up on these heads, and the angle is straight into the valve. So don't get me wrong. These heads flowing, you know, in the low 400s, they flow 417, 408, 417. These heads here, I can't remember the exact numbers. It's been so long. It's literally been, you know, a couple decades plus, but I want to say these flowed like 573 or something. Like they're way up there. Huge numbers. The remarkable thing when you see these two heads sitting next to each other is that both of these heads will bolt onto my engine. And, you know, look, sitting on the bench, look at the difference in the port location compared to the AFR head. So, yeah. But this literally, these two heads literally have the same bolt pattern and would bolt right on to the same engine. Well, maybe not, because the piston dome, I don't know. I doubt the piston would clear this chamber, but if there were no pistons in the block, these two heads would physically bolt on to the same engine. And another kind of stark comparison is on these stock heads. If you look at the opening, the actual opening size, a little ways in the port compared to the AFRs, this area in here from the roof to the floor is actually smaller than the stock head. This port's quite a bit wider, but having this port floor actually ramp up and then make a nice radius down into the valve makes the heads flow way better. Where this one, you get the light so you can see it. This one, the port floor is just flat and it just goes right into the valve, and they just flow like garbage that way. So that's just to illustrate that bigger does not mean more flow. And even on the Pro Stock head, if you look, the port floor doesn't just go, you know, straight into the side of the valve. There's a huge radius at the port floor, and then it makes a big turn and goes down into the valve. And again, that's part of the advantage of having the port raised so much higher to begin with. Again, to illustrate, you've got this whole section cylinder head, which we welded on a bunch more even to tip this angle up. And then on this stock head, that, you know, there's the deck and there's the bottom of the port. So big difference from the bottom of the port to where this bolts to the engine, where this is like 3/8 of an inch at the most from the deck of the block. And this is probably 2 inches from the deck of the block on to the bottom of the port. Just for illustration purposes. So let's put a tape measure here. So we're what? I'd call it 2 3/8 from the deck. And then again, the AFR head, and AFR said, hold my Shirley Temple. We're gonna go to, we'll call that probably 2 3/4 to 2 7/8. So that's a big difference. Raise that exhaust port up. And by the way, when I ported these exhausts, there was not a lot that had to be done, and they're really good for an out-of-the-box head. These are flowing right out about 300 CFM on the exhaust, and that is fantastic. especially for a street performance head, or even if you're going to drag race with that head. And then when we get to the Pro Stock stuff, because that one that's way up there, 3.25 probably, raised from the deck. These are all measurements from the deck of the heads. So yeah, these, you look at where the valve cover rail is here, right, and see the port, valve cover rail and port, and then you look at the valve cover rail on this thing and you got port. So yeah, those exhaust ports are way up there.